Human sexuality has multiple meanings, although reproduction is considered the focus of sexual activity. Despite this, human sexuality began to lose its exclusive reproductive meaning very early in the evolution of the genus Homo, and with a concealed ovulation and a female accessible to the male during the entire menstrual cycle, the need became that of avoiding, rather than seeking conception during intercourse. The contraceptive revolutions of the 20th century, sex without reproduction, reproduction without sex, reproduction in menopause, and one day, reproduction without gametes, are having a major impact on the lives of individual couples and women. At the same time, this tumultuous progress drew the attention of religious moralists. Since ethics have always focused on sexuality and its moral regulation, Catholic ethicists have been at the forefront of the battle against dehumanizing the reproductive process, whereas Judaism took a much more open position. Early Christian teaching on sexuality focused on abstinence. This is because Christ himself defined celibacy as a better life choice for human beings. Drawing on this basis, early church fathers developed the concept, upheld until the 20th century, that intercourse is justifiable only to procreate. Today, some cautious overtures are being made, and the Church has recognized that sexuality can be an expression of conjugal love independent from procreation. Now only come outside religion, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. The word sex itself stems from Old French, with an origin around 1200. At that time, the word simply referred to genitals. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that it was first used to refer to the act of intercourse, and this usage became more popular in the earlier 20th century. So how did we refer to the act before then? There is a different perspective about how sex became a thing. Reproduction, including modes of sexual reproduction, features in the writings of Aristotle. Modern philosophical scientific thinking on the problem dates from at least Erasmus Darwin, 1731 to 1802, in the 18th century. August Weismann picked up the thread in 1885, arguing that sex serves to generate genetic variation, as detailed in the majority of the explanations below. On the other hand, Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, concluded that the effect of hybrid vigor, complementation, is amply sufficient to account for the genesis of the two sexes. This is consistent with the repair and complementation hypothesis described below. The reason why you could be alive today is because of the word sex. They call it reproduction. We all know that passing genes on to the next generation is essentially a part of life. Before sex existed, most life appears to have reproduced asexually. That is to say, that was primarily a process of cell division, just like most single-celled organisms still do today. This is a simple copy and divide process that most plants, bacteria, and animals do today. Compared to sexual reproduction, it is a much less messy affair and doesn't require the vast amounts of energy required for sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, requires an organism to invest far larger amounts of energy and resources to achieve it. It is more hit and miss and can even be dangerous or potentially fatal to the organism. From Wikipedia, sexual reproduction is an adaptive feature which is common to almost all multicellular organisms, and also some single-cellular organisms, with many being incapable of reproducing asexually. Before the advent of sexual reproduction, the adaptation process whereby genes would change from one generation to the next, genetic mutation, happened very slowly and randomly. Sex evolved as an extremely efficient mechanism for producing variation, and this had the major advantage of enabling organisms to adapt to changing environments. Sex did, however, come with a cost. In reproducing asexually, no time nor energy needs to be expended in choosing a mate. And if the environment has not changed, then there may be little reason for the variation, as the organism may already be well adapted. Sex, however, has evolved as the most prolific means of species branching into the tree of life. Diversification into the phylogenetic tree happens much more rapidly via sexual reproduction than it does by way of asexual reproduction. Why has sex become a thing? Because other organisms reproduce without sex, like flatworms, when divided fan reproduces itself. Microbes offer new copies of themselves, so sex is not required for all reproduction. The truth is why sex exists is one of the big unanswered questions in evolutionary biology. Any concept in life has sex. There has been research about which living thing was the first to come to the revolutionary process called sexual reproduction, but we can try to follow up on the history of sex. But the origin of sex is probably far older than that. After all, we know that all sexually reproducing organisms probably had a common ancestor at some point in time. Why sex became a thing and some of the earliest animals. There was a time before there was ever sex on Earth. To research, between 2 billion and 2.5 billion years ago, the planet was home to simple, single-celled organisms like bacteria and archaea. Their main mode of reproduction was and still is to clone themselves. They duplicate their single chromosome and then split into two, with each offspring getting a copy of the original. That means the offspring are always identical to their parent. For a long time, this has worked out fine, as said by researchers. Now, bacteria do have ways of swapping small amounts of DNA among themselves, and of packing up DNA from their environment, which changes their genetic makeup. But sexual reproduction in the strictest sense, where offsprings get an equal share of two parents' DNA, did not show up until well into the Proterozoic Eon. The origin of sexual reproduction can be traced to early prokaryotes, around 2 billion years ago, when bacteria began exchanging genes via conjugation, transformation, and transduction. Though these processes are distinct from true sexual reproduction, they share some basic similarities. In eukaryotes, true sex is thought to have arisen in the last eukaryotic common ancestor. That includes anything that has a nucleus of the cell. So, all the fungi, all the protists, every long thing that has been seen with our eye. Liceae isn't a specific thing that we have found in the fossil record, but we can infer its existence because all eukaryotes that are alive today are thought to have descended from a single eukaryotic species. So Liceae isn't the very first eukaryote. It's the most common ancestor of all modern eukaryotes, the ones we know today. We can infer what is in common now, which is sex. Since hypotheses for the origin of sex are difficult to verify experimentally outside of evolutionary computation, most current work has focused on the persistence of sexual reproduction over evolutionary time. The maintenance of sexual reproduction, specifically of its dioecious form, by natural selection in a highly competitive world, has long been one of the major mysteries of biology, since both other known mechanisms of reproduction, asexual reproduction and hermaphroditism, possess apparent advantages over it. Asexual reproduction can proceed by budding, fission, or spore formation and does not involve the union of gametes, which accordingly results in a much faster rate of reproduction compared to sexual reproduction, where 50% of offspring are males and unable to produce offspring themselves. In hermaphroditic reproduction, each of the two parent organisms required for the formation of a zygote can provide either the male or the female gamete, which leads to advantages in both size and genetic variance of a population. When we talk about sexual reproduction, we are talking about cells that divide their chromosomes into sets and duplicate those sets and then separate them into many new cells. Those cells with one set of chromosomes are gametes. They begin to look for compatible gametes for another parent that has its own set of chromosomes. Since each parent has a slightly different combination of genes in its chromosomes, when their gametes combine, the offspring that they produce will be different every time. This process takes a lot of time to master, and it may or may not have been perfected by Liceae's time. Now we go to animals. They are a little more obvious about our mating habits, and the oldest fossil we have that is interpreted as direct evidence of sex is of an animal.